The sun beat down like a punishment in Barren Ridge, baking the dirt until it cracked like old skin and clung to boots with every step. The wind offered no relief and carried the stench of sweat, horses, and something meaner. A circle of men, half drunk and wholly cruel, gathered in front of the Red Ox saloon, their voices rough with heat and whiskey. On the makeshift platform, 3 splintered boards laid across 2 barrels stood the last lot of the day. A girl. She couldn't have been more than 17, though filth and fear had aged her face. Her skin was dusted with grime, her lips chapped and split. A torn linen shift clung to her thin frame, and bruises bloomed like spilled ink across her arms and legs. Her long black hair hung in tangled ropes down her back, and her wrists bore rusted shackles that dragged as she moved. Not that she moved much. She didn't cry, didn't speak. Just stood there, staring past the crowd, like her mind had floated somewhere safer. The auctioneer wiped his forehead with a stained handkerchief, looking bored. "All right, boys, last one. Imported from the Orient, or so the feller who sold her claims. Quiet type. Don't eat much, no name, far as I can tell. We'll start the bidding at $1. Laughter rolled through the crowd like thunder off canyon walls. "A whole dollar?" someone jeered. "Hell, I wouldn't give a plug nickel," another shouted. "She even speak English?" a third slurred. "Don't need her to speak," someone muttered, and the others roared with laughter. The girl didn't flinch, didn't blink. She was a statue carved from shame and silence. $1, the auctioneer tried again, less confident now. "Come on, gents. You got more than that in your back teeth." 50 cents, a voice called, mocking. "And she better scrub floors with that silence." The auctioneer grumbled, but before he could respond, a voice came from the back. Not loud, not angry, just firm. 3. Everything stopped, heads turned, the laughter died like a match in the wind. A tall man stood near the edge of the crowd, where the light from the saloon lanterns barely reached. Dust clung to his coat and the wide brim of his weather-worn hat. His boots were scuffed, spurs dull with rust. His face was cut from stone angular, shadowed by a scruffy beard, unreadable except for the steel-gray eyes that locked on the auctioneer like judgment passed from on high. $3? The auctioneer blinked, incredulous. The man said nothing, just nodded once and reached into his coat, pulling out a small roll of silver coins and dropping them one by one into his palm. The sound of metal on skin echoed in the sudden hush. No one laughed now. The auctioneer cleared his throat. "Sold." The gavel never fell. There was no applause, just the shuffle of boots as men backed away from the stranger who'd just bought the girl nobody wanted for 3 times more than she was worth. She looked up, just once, and for the first time in days, the mask of numbness cracked. Not from fear, not from pain, but something worse, confusion. She'd expected cruelty. Expected to be dragged somewhere darker, but the tall man didn't move toward her with hunger or fists. He just turned and walked away. And when the auctioneer shoved her forward, she stumbled after him, still barefoot, still bleeding, but with a flicker of something behind her eyes she hadn't felt in weeks. Hope, or maybe just disbelief. The people of Barren Ridge watched in stunned silence as Gideon Trace crossed the open street, with the girl trailing behind him like a shadow stitched to his boot heels. Dust swirled in the wake of their passage, the air too thick and the hour too strange for anyone to speak. The auctioneer clutched the silver like it might burn through his fingers, glancing nervously at the coins as if they'd been cursed. Gideon Trace hadn't set foot in town in nearly 5 years, not since the fire took his wife and the boy disappeared 2 months later, never found. Since then, he'd become a legend whispered about in saloons and bunkhouses. They called him the ghost of Juniper Mesa, the dead farmer, the hollow man. Some said he buried himself alive in his ranch and only rose to tend the graves. Others claimed they saw his lantern flickering at night, wandering the hills, searching for something only he could name. But there he was now, flesh and blood, tall and broad and unmistakably real, his hat low and jaw set like granite. He didn't acknowledge the gawkers, didn't flinch at the murmurs. He just kept walking steady, deliberate, until he reached the weather-beaten chestnut that waited patiently beside the general store. The girl hesitated when he approached the saddlebag, unsure if she was meant to be lifted or leashed. He didn't touch her. Instead, Gideon pulled a faded wool blanket from his pack and handed it to her without a word. She stared at it as if it were a foreign thing, her shackled wrists trembling. Then, slowly, she draped it over her shoulders. He untied a second horse, smaller and lean, then pressed the reins into her bruised hands. Again, no command, no harsh glance. Just that quiet, inscrutable patience, like he was waiting for her to decide whether to ride or run. She mounted. That alone made a few mouths drop open. The horse shifted beneath her but didn't protest. It was as if even the animals understood not to challenge whatever strange magic had passed between the two. They left town in silence. From the saloon porch, old Deke whispered, "That man just bought a ghost and took it home." No one laughed. Not because it wasn't funny, but because it was too true. The sun was lowering behind the hills by the time Gideon and the girl reached the first ridge above town, the sharp rocks giving way to dry grass and sagebrush. The ranch lay beyond a weathered two-story house, pale from wind and time, with a broken fence line and shuttered windows that hadn't seen oil in years. It didn't look lived in. It looked like it had been mourning. When they dismounted, Gideon led her inside, boots thudding softly against old floorboards. The place smelled of dust and memory. He pointed to a small room off the kitchen with a narrow cot and clean water in a basin. She stepped inside. He didn't lock the door. Instead, Gideon Trace walked back outside and sat on the porch under the purple sky, facing the wind with his hands folded in his lap and eyes closed, not asleep, not at peace, but still. Like a man waiting for the past to catch up, or for forgiveness that might never come. The room was small, just wide enough for the narrow cot, and a wooden chair that wobbled slightly when she touched it. A thin blanket, folded with care, rested at the foot of the bed, and beside the basin of clean water sat a cloth and a sliver of soap worn down from years of quiet use. There were no locks on the door, no bars on the window, no eyes watching from the shadows, just silence, a kind that pressed against her chest like a heavy hand. She stood in the doorway for a long time, unmoving, uncertain. The last house she'd been brought to had hidden ropes behind curtains. The one before that had no doors at all. And the one before, she didn't let herself remember. So when Gideon Trace placed a chipped porcelain bowl of steaming stew on the small table beside the cot, she flinched and backed into the wall, her shoulders curling as if expecting a blow. But the blow never came. He didn't touch her, didn't speak, just set the bowl down, nodded once, and walked away, his boots trailing dust down the hall. A door creaked open at the far end of the house, then clicked shut again. After that, only the creaking of the old wooden frame settling into the night. She stayed where she was, motionless, for what felt like hours. The stew cooled, its scent mixing with the dry smell of cedar and old linens. Her stomach twisted, not from hunger, but from the memory of meals given as bait. She couldn't trust it. Couldn't trust him. So she didn't eat. She didn't lie down either. Instead, she sat on the floor beside the bed, knees tucked against her chest, arms wrapped around her legs. Through the cracked pane of glass above her, she watched the stars prick through the dark like tiny, trembling lanterns. There were no voices in this place. No slurred laughter, no cruel commands, no doors slamming, no boots stomping, just wind brushing the outside walls and an occasional coyote howl in the distance. The quiet unnerved her more than screams. Still, she didn't move. At one point in the night, she heard him stir boards creaking under heavy steps as he shifted in the front room. Then, silence again. He wasn't watching her. He wasn't lurking. It was as if he truly had nothing more to give than space and food and the choice to accept or refuse. When the sky finally began to lighten with the dull gray of dawn, she was still there, arms asleep, legs numb, head tilted against the wall. Her eyes were red but dry. The stew sat untouched. She heard the door open and braced herself without thinking, her breath held tight. But it wasn't her door, it was the front door of the house, Boots on the porch. A soft rustle as someone poured feed into a trough. She crept to the hallway and peered around the corner. There he was, Gideon Trace standing beside the barn with a bucket in one hand and a bundle of hay in the other, feeding horses, as if nothing had happened the day before. As if buying a girl like a bag of grain was no different than tending to the livestock, but there was no violence in his movements. No demand in his eyes when he glanced back at the house and saw her watching him through the screen. He just nodded once and went back to work. And for the first time in years, she wasn't told what to do. She wasn't forced. She wasn't claimed. She was just left to be. It wasn't until the third morning that she spoke. The days had passed in slow silence, broken only by the creak of the windmill, the rhythmic clatter of hooves in the pasture, and the soft murmur of the wind whispering across the grass. Gideon Trace didn't try to talk to her. He didn't press, didn't pry. He simply moved through the ranch like a man stitched to habit, waking before dawn, feeding the animals, chopping firewood, patching fences, tending to what needed tending. And she watched. At first from behind the doorframe, cautious and still. Then from the porch, knees pulled to her chest, blanket draped over her shoulders as the morning chill clung to her bones. He left the door open each day, left a bowl of stew, a piece of bread, and a tin cup of water on the table. She never touched them while he was in the room, but by nightfall, they were always empty. He noticed, never said a word. Then came the third day. She stood at the edge of the corral, the dust swirling around her bare feet, eyes following him as he raked straw into neat rows. The rake was heavy, wooden, well used. He paused and leaned it against the fence, then turned, as if sensing her watching. She stepped forward, just once, her fingers curled into her palms, her lips parted. "Why?" The word came out dry, brittle, not like a question, more like a crack in something that had been frozen too long. Gideon didn't answer. Not with words. He walked to the fence, lifted the rake, and offered it to her with a slow, steady hand. No pressure, no command, just the choice. She took it. Her fingers were too small for the handle, too soft for the splinters. But she didn't flinch. He showed her how to angle the rake, how to push the straw in one direction, then pull it back smooth. It was clumsy at first, but he didn't correct her, just mirrored her movements beside her until she matched his rhythm. When the animals gathered near the fence, he pointed one by one. "Sable," he said, motioning to the mare. "Clint," he added, nodding to the ornery goat that headbutted the gatepost. "Roscoe," for the toothless dog sprawled under the cartwheel. She repeated the names softly, the sounds thick on her tongue. Later that evening, he drew a rough circle in the dirt with a stick and pointed to the sun, then the line. "Time," he said. Then he drew a second circle with tiny marks around the edge. "Clock." He tapped his wrist, then the sky. "Sun tells time." She stared at him, squinting like she was trying to see something just beyond the edge of understanding. And then, without warning, she said it. "Mylan." He looked at her, not surprised, just listening. She pressed a hand to her chest. "Malin," she repeated, firmer this time. He nodded. "Malin. I'm from Guangzhou." Her voice trembled but didn't break. "My father sold me." She didn't cry, didn't blink, just stood there in the dusk, wind lifting strands of her hair as if to carry her words away before they could settle into grief. Gideon said nothing. He just reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a red handkerchief, and handed it to her. Not to wipe tears, just to have. And for the first time, Malin didn't feel like a thing that had been taken. She felt like a person beginning again. The sky over Juniper Mesa was washed in the pale gold of late afternoon when the riders came. Dust kicked high behind their horses like smoke trailing a fire, their figures outlined sharp against the sun. Malin saw them first, her small hands wrapped around the bucket she'd been carrying from the well. She froze. The horses were lean, fast, and cruel-looking, much like their riders. 3 men, each branded in their own way, not with irons, but with expressions sharpened by a life of taking what wasn't offered. Their hats sat low over their eyes, spurs jangling as they dismounted in unison. One had a snake tattoo curling from his neck to his jawline. Another chewed something black and oily, spitting onto the dirt before he even said hello. The third quietest of the bunch had a twitch in his left eye and a scar that split his bottom lip in two. They smelled like gunpowder and bad intentions. Malin backed up, the bucket forgotten at her feet. Well, well, the tallest drawled, glancing around the yard. Place is just as dead as we heard, except for the new ornament. The one with the twitch sneered. Heard Gideon Trace picked himself up a prize. Foreign one, too. Shiny. Tame? Gideon stepped out of the barn without a word. The hammer he'd been using rested loosely in one hand, the sleeves of his shirt rolled high, arms dusted with grit. He didn't blink. Didn't look startled. Just walked toward the fence with the calm of a man who'd seen worse and lived through it. She's not yours, the one with the lip scar said, eyeing Malin. We just want to look. Maybe a taste if she's friendly. Gideon stopped at the gate, set the hammer down beside it, and looked up. His voice, when it came, was low, flat, measured. You leave now, or you don't leave at all. The men laughed, the sound sharp and mean. Oh, come on now, Trace, said the tall one, his fingers brushing the handle of the revolver at his side. We're just being neighborly. Gideon's face didn't change. The one with the twitch took a step forward. You gone soft, old man? Didn't you used to be something before you turned into a ghost? Now, you're just a loner holed up with a... He never finished the sentence. The sound of Gideon's revolver was louder than thunder. It cracked through the quiet like the sky had split open, and the man with the twitch went down hard, screaming as blood bloomed from his thigh. He'd never even cleared leather. The others drew their weapons too late. Gideon didn't fire again. He didn't have to. The message was written in dust and blood. You want the next one in your gut? He asked, eyes still locked on the tall one. The man's jaw clenched. His bravado faltered. Slowly, he helped his wounded friend up, both of them pale and shaking. The one with the snake tattoo spat again, this time with less venom, and swung into the saddle. We ain't forgetting this, he snarled. You better, Gideon said. The horses wheeled and galloped off, hooves thundering against the earth as fast as pride would let them run. When it was over, Malin stood at the edge of the porch, heart pounding in her throat. Gideon didn't look at her. He just walked back to the barn, picked up the hammer, and went back to mending the fence like it had been just another chore. But Malin saw it, the tightness in his jaw, the way his hands trembled when he thought no one was watching. He hadn't fired to kill, just to warn, but he would have. She knew it now. Not because she belonged to him, but because someone finally believed she shouldn't belong to anyone at all. The barn smelled of hay, rusted tools, and something older like sorrow baked into the beams. Malin had begun sweeping without being asked, brushing dust from corners and collecting broken nails and bits of rope that served no purpose anymore. She worked in silence, as always, but her eyes were curious. Observing, learning. In the loft, beneath a warped wooden plank near the back wall, her broom caught something strange, a soft thud that didn't sound like dirt or nail heads. She crouched, prying up the loose board with her fingers, careful not to splinter them. Beneath it lay a single envelope, yellowed and curling at the edges, wrapped in a bit of faded twine. She turned it over in her hands. There was no stamp, no seal. Just one word scratched in blue ink, written with a trembling hand that had pressed too hard in some places and barely at all in others. Father. Malin sat cross-legged in the loft, the letter resting in her lap. She debated opening it. Her instincts whispered caution. But another part of her, deeper, quieter, told her this wasn't meant to stay hidden. Whatever pain it carried, it wasn't hers. Still, she read it. The handwriting was clumsy but young. The papers smelled like dust and time. Dear Father, I don't know if you'll ever read this. I don't even know if I want you to. I hated you when I left. I blamed you for everything: Ma's death, the silence that came after, the way you looked through me like I wasn't there. I took your horse. I lied. I said I'd never come back. But I was wrong. I was a boy trying to run from grief wearing a man's boots. I don't know how to fix it, but I wish I could come home. David. The name landed in Malin's chest like a stone. She didn't fold the letter. She didn't tuck it back into the floorboards. Instead, she walked down the ladder, crossed the barn, and entered the house with the envelope still pressed in her hand. The air inside was warm with the scent of fresh cornbread. Gideon was outside somewhere, feeding the animals or splitting logs. She set the letter on the kitchen table in silence. No note, no question. Just the letter, waiting. He came in later, dusty and sweat-lined, his boots scuffing across the floorboards. She was by the window, sewing a rip in one of her old dresses. When he saw the envelope, he froze. For a long time, he just stood there, staring at the word like it was a ghost with teeth. Then he walked past it, poured himself water, sat in the chair, never touched it. Never asked how she'd found it. That night, he didn't eat dinner, he didn't speak. But early the next morning, as the first hint of pink bloomed in the eastern sky, Malin awoke to the sound of weeping. Not loud, not broken. Just quiet, aching sobs from the barn. She crept to the doorway, her bare feet cold on the floor. Through the crack in the wood, she saw him. Gideon Trace, the man who hadn't spoken more than a dozen words in a week, knelt beside the open floorboard, the letter unfolded in his hands, his shoulders shaking with the kind of grief that only comes when too many years have passed, and the apology you never got becomes the one you wish you could give. She didn't interrupt, didn't make a sound. But in that moment, something between them changed. She had been bought, and he had been broken, but here, in the silence of the barn, in the truth of that letter, they were something else entirely. Two people learning how to live again. The man rode in just after noon, coated in trail dust and silence, with a sun-scorched hat pulled low and a revolver that looked like it had seen the inside of more than one grave. He dismounted slowly, like he had all the time in the world and nothing left to lose. Malin saw him from the porch, her sewing needle frozen mid-stitch. Something about the way he moved made the hair at the back of her neck rise. Gideon stepped out of the barn, wiping his hands on a rag, expression unreadable as the stranger approached. "You Gideon Trace?" the man asked, voice like gravel ground through whiskey. His accent wasn't local sharper, clipped. California, maybe. "I am," Gideon answered, slow and even. The man reached into his coat pocket, not fast, but not slow enough to put anyone at ease, and pulled out a folded slip of paper, yellowed, torn at the corners. He flicked it open with one hand and held it out. "Looking for a girl. Name's Malin Wong. Real quiet, real pretty. Says here she was last seen with an older man, white hair, fits your description. $50 for her safe return." The porch went still. Malin stood behind the screen door, her body stiff as wood. The name hit her like a slap. She hadn't heard her full name spoken aloud in months, not since the auction, not since the voyage, not since her father signed the papers. Seeing it printed in thick, ink-smudged letters beneath the sketch of her face made it real in a way she'd been trying to outrun. "Property of Chan Tong Syndicate," the poster read, stamped with a red dragon seal. Beneath that, the words, "Reward. No questions asked." Gideon didn't look at Malin, didn't flinch. He stared at the paper, then reached out, took it, and turned it slowly in his fingers. Then, without a word, he stepped back into the house, crossed to the hearth, and tossed the bounty sheet into the flames. It curled and blackened, the ink warping as the fire took it. The name burned last, Malin Wong, before disappearing in a puff of smoke. No one owns you, Gideon said quietly, the firelight dancing in his eyes. The bounty hunter raised a brow, unimpressed. That was mine. So send me a bill, Gideon replied. The man shifted, resting a hand near his hip. You don't understand how this works, old man. You're hiding Chan Tong's property. They don't take kindly to theft. I was just sent to find her. The next ones? They won't knock. Gideon's jaw tightened. Then they best come ready. The hunter looked past him, toward Malin, who stood frozen in the shadows. Her hands trembled at her sides, her eyes wide with the kind of fear that goes deeper than bone. I'll tell them she wasn't here, the man said after a pause, but they won't believe me. He turned without another word and climbed onto his horse, riding off without so much as a backward glance. As the sound of hooves faded, Gideon finally turned to Malin. Her lips parted like she might speak, but no sound came, only the soft rustle of her skirt and the quiet panic in her breath. You're safe here, he said. But they both knew the truth. Safe was a word that didn't last long when men like Chan Tong were sending others to collect what they thought they owned. And more were coming. The sun had barely crested the hills when the sound of hooves broke the stillness. Not the slow, familiar rhythm of ranch stock, but something heavier, faster, filled with purpose. Malin was feeding the chickens when she heard it. 6 horses, maybe more, coming hard from the southern ridge. Dust kicked up like a warning cloud behind them, and glints of metal flashed in the early light. Rifles. Mahadis. She dropped the feed bucket. Gideon? He was already on the porch, squinting into the distance, rifle in hand. The old Henry, worn but clean. His face didn't change, but Malin saw the breath he drew long and slow, like a man steeling himself for something that wouldn't be undone. They're from Chan Tong, she said, voice shaking. I know their colors. He didn't ask how, didn't ask what they wanted. He already knew. They'll kill you, she whispered. Please, we have to run. But Gideon Trace shook his head. If I run, they'll follow. They'll burn everything behind us to prove a point. Then hide. We both can. No, he said, firm now. You'll hide. I'll finish this. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded parchment, yellowed and creased. The deed. He placed it in her hands like it was a living thing. You own this land now, he said. They take me, they don't take this. Malin tried to speak, but the words broke in her throat. Go to the ravine, he said. Take the horses. Wait till nightfall. If I'm not back. No, she choked. You'll come back. Gideon paused then, his hand resting on her shoulder. You gave me something I thought was gone. A reason to stand again. That's more than most men get. He turned before she could stop him, slinging a heavy satchel over his shoulder. It clanked as he walked, the unmistakable sound of glass bottles and powder. Dynamite. Malin watched from the barn's shadow as he mounted his horse and rode toward the ridge. His figure grew smaller with every stride, but his presence never felt more enormous. From her hiding place in the ravine, tucked low in the sagebrush with the horses breathing warm and tense beside her, she saw it unfold. 6 riders crested the hill, all men. Faces cold, eyes dead. One held a red silk flag with a black dragon stitched through it, flapping in the wind like a dare. Gideon rode alone to meet them. He stopped 20 yards away, rifle slung low, satchel still tight against his back. They laughed when they saw him. One dismounted, swinging a machete lazily. Then Gideon raised the rifle. One shot. The machete wielder dropped where he stood, a clean hole through his chest. Chaos exploded. The others scattered, rifles up, shouting in Cantonese and broken English. But Gideon didn't run. He rode straight into them. The satchel dropped mid-charge, hitting the dirt hard and fast, a fuse already lit. Malin covered her ears. The explosion shattered the morning calm fire, erupting in a burst of red and black, smoke climbing the sky like it was clawing at heaven. Horses screamed, men fell, bodies flung like ragdolls across the dust. When it cleared, the mesa burned. Flames licked the dry grass. The red silk flag hung in tatters from a broken spear. And in the center of it all, Gideon lay in the dirt, smoke curling from his coat, blood blooming on his side but alive. 6 men had come to claim a girl like property. None of them rode home. The fire had burned down to smoke by the time Malin dared crawl out from the ravine. The horses snorted and trembled behind her, their hooves restless in the dust, but she couldn't stop to calm them. Her feet carried her over scorched earth and blackened weeds, past twisted metal and ash-covered bone. The red silk flag, now nothing more than a charred ribbon, fluttered weakly from the wreckage of what once was a man's pride. She found Gideon in the center of it, all half buried beneath a broken wagon wheel, blood seeping from a gash in his side, his arm crushed at an unnatural angle. His shirt was torn, stained with powder burns and soaked through. One eye was swollen shut, the other fluttered open as her shadow passed across him. "Mylin," he rasped. "Don't speak," she whispered, tears already streaking down her cheeks as she dropped to her knees beside him. It took everything she had to drag his body back to the house feet, slipping in the dirt, arms burning, breath shallow. She stopped only once, long enough to grab a length of canvas from the barn to lay him on. By the time she reached the porch, sweat and soot had turned her skin to clay. She got him inside, laid him out on the kitchen table, and boiled water with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. She stitched the wound herself. Her needlework wasn't clean, but it was firm. She remembered her mother's hands doing the same long ago, before the sea, before the boat, before everything. She tore her own dress to make bandages, pressed a cool cloth to his fevered skin, and stayed awake for 2 nights straight just to be sure he still breathed. When it was over, she buried the bodies. All 6. Alone. She didn't mark their graves. She didn't say their names. On the 4th day, Gideon sat up. Weak, pale, alive. They didn't speak for a while. Malin brought him broth, changed his bandages, swept ash from the doorway every morning. He watched her. Watched the way she moved through the house like she belonged there because now she did. It was on the 7th day, as the sun hung low and gold over the fence line, that he finally broke the silence. "My wife's name was Miriam," he said, voice hoarse and low. "She died in a house fire. I wasn't there. I was in town, drinking. Came home to smoke and silence." Mylin didn't speak. She just listened. "Our son, David. He ran away after. Blamed me. I blamed me too. He wrote once. I never wrote back." He paused, swallowing the weight of it. "I thought if I kept to myself, stayed quiet, the world wouldn't ask anything more of me. I was wrong. Then you showed up." Gideon shifted, grimacing, and reached beneath the table. He pulled out the deed she had once held. "This land is yours now," he said. "It always was. You saved it. You saved me." Malin took the paper slowly, her hands trembling not from fear this time, but from something she couldn't name. He smiled, just a little. The first time she'd seen him do so. "You're not what was bought," he said. "You're what was given." The wind blew softer now over Juniper Mesa. The dry grass no longer whispered of ghosts but of growth, of something new taking root where blood once stained the earth. The ranch had been rebuilt slowly, steadily, with hands that knew pain and hands that had learned peace. The barn had a fresh coat of whitewash, the fences were mended tight, and at the front gate, carved into a newly hung plank of pine, were 3 bold words burned clean into the wood. Trace Ranch. Not Miss Wong, not property of, not Lot 32. Just M. Trace. She rode now daily, confidently wearing old leather boots that creaked when she walked, and a wide-brimmed hat too big for her head but perfect for the sun. Her voice remained soft, but it no longer shook. When she gave orders to the hands Gideon hired to help, they listened. When she visited town for supplies, folks nodded respectfully and called her Miss Trace. No one asked what her story was. In towns like Barren Ridge, you didn't pry into someone who'd survived the fire and still stood tall. That sort of thing earned its own legend. Gideon spent most of his days on the porch now, wrapped in a blanket, a cane resting beside his chair. The wound from the Chantong fight had healed crooked, but it hadn't taken his spirit. Malin read to him in the evening sold letters, newspaper clippings, sometimes stories she wrote herself in a little brown journal. He'd close his eyes and listen, one hand always curled around the mug of strong tea she'd learned to make the way he liked, no sugar, just fire. They didn't talk much about what came before. It lived in the corners of the house like old, paint-faded, permanent, but no longer bleeding. Sometimes, when the wind came in sharp from the west, he'd whisper his son's name and she'd squeeze his hand in silence. They understood each other. Not through blood, but through something deeper. Something earned. The neighbors noticed. So did the sheriff, but no one questioned it. Then, one afternoon near the end of spring, a traveler arrived. He came on foot, dusty and thin, with a worn guitar slung across his back and hunger in his eyes. Malin was tending the garden out front when he paused at the gate, reading the carved name with a tilt of the head. "This Gideon Trace's place?" he asked, voice rough with road dust. Malin stood, wiping her hands on her skirt. She looked him over. The boy was young, maybe 20, with sunburnt cheeks and calloused hands that didn't match the softness in his voice. She nodded. It was. The boy blinked. "He's still here?" Malin's gaze drifted toward the porch, where Gideon dozed in his chair, bathed in golden light, the cane resting across his lap like a badge of survival. She looked back at the traveler, her eyes calm and steady. "It was his," she said. "Now it's mine." The traveler tipped his hat. "Miss Trace." And for the first time in a long, long life, Malin smiled like someone who belonged exactly where she stood.